So my name is Robert Ballingall. I'm a PhD candidate in the Department of Political Science, and I'm a TA. I've been a TA for many years now. So I'm the kind of person who will be grading your papers. So I think I probably have some half-decent advice about how to write a good paper, because I've read a lot of them, and I'm very used to sort of parsing them, the better from the worse. So what I'm going to do in this little 20-minute workshop is just to kind of go through some of the main elements of what a strong scholarly or academic essay involves. So just hands up, how many of you guys have written an essay for a university level course before? Probably. Okay, so a few of you. Right, of course. Yeah. So maybe it'll be helpful. So I just want, so those of you who have, I mean, I guess I shouldn't have projected this up here already, but in your experience, what are some of the most important components of a good essay? Like, if you've gotten good grades on the papers that you've written, what do you think you did that made the paper good?
Smooth and coherent transitions between paragraphs.
That's really important. Yeah. So what do you mean by that a bit more specifically?
Like segueing in the subject of the previous paragraph into the subject of the next paragraph. It's like this is a pretty bad one, but saying, well, this is important. This is even more important. Like just like that, making them two connect.
Right. No, I think that's a key consideration. Anything else? Anyone else who's written papers before, academic papers? Go ahead.
Don't forget a title.
Don't forget a title. Yeah, I know there's these funny. I hadn't thought of that. But that's a good point. Go ahead.
I think structure is really important.
Structure.
And laying out how you're going to go about your essay at the beginning is really important.
So in your introduction, kind of sketch out the paper as a whole. Yeah, that's great. That's really helpful too. Go ahead.
Keep your purpose in mind, keep everything concise, and just ramble on about something.
Vital. Keep your purpose in mind. Yeah, I think that's a great way of putting it. Yeah, these are all things most of these things are things that I've put on this handout. So I'm actually going to distribute it now. And I'm going to distribute it along with this other handout that has information about the college writing centers at U of T. So if you want to take one of these and pass them around. So there's two handouts. So make sure you get a copy of each one. So basically what you're doing when you're writing an essay, a scholarly essay, an academic paper, is you're recording, you're articulating to an audience the process of thinking that you went through to arrive at your thesis statement. Okay? So an essay, I think this is a really important thing to think about what an essay is. An essay, it's an account of a process of reasoning. Okay? It's an account of how it is that you arrived at the main aim or claim of the paper. And as that suggests, before you write the paper, you want to have gone through that process of reasoning. So you don't start writing a paper by starting to write the actual essay, right? You start writing a paper by going through the procedure of thinking about the topic. Sometimes that means doing research in the library. Sometimes it means going over notes that you've taken from lectures or from closely reading a key text or textbook. But what you want to do is you want to create usually in note form, an argument or a list of reasons why you think that a particular claim, which is going to be your thesis statement, is true. So I'm going to kind of break that down a bit. So that particular claim, right, is the thesis statement, right? So that's why I say there's three necessary conditions, I think, to a strong essay. And the first is that you have a thesis statement, but that thesis statement needs to have these four components, right? And the first one is that you formulate your thesis statement after you've considered the relevant evidence or literature on the subject that you're writing it on. And and as I say, a strong essay essentially explains the process of reasoning through which you've gone in order to arrive at the view articulated in your thesis statement. But second, and just as importantly, what a thesis statement does is it responds directly to the essay question that you've been asked, right? So you're gonna, like in Pol 101, you're gonna get this essay topic, or in other courses, you're gonna have essay assignments, and usually they're gonna assign you an essay question. And the most important thing you can do, apart from going through this process of reasoning before you write your paper, is that the thesis that you come up with that you're going to write your paper around actually responds directly to the essay question, is a response to that question. Because sometimes students, they formulate theses or the main aim of their paper that doesn't seem to respond to the essay question directly or maybe at all. And if that happens, you're not going to do very well in the paper, right? So that's the second crucial thing. The third is that you offer as an answer to the essay question what I'm calling a non-obvious proposition. So what I mean there is that it's not a claim that's true by definition, right? Which is called a tautology, right? So the reason why you want your thesis statement to be non-obvious is that you want it should be something that you have to argue for, right? Otherwise, what's the point of your argument? And you're actually going to find that it's hard to come up with an argument if your thesis statement is sort of self-justifying or obvious. If a reasonable person couldn't disagree with it. So therefore, usually what you want to do in formulating a thesis question, or a thesis statement rather, is to think about what's a controversy? How could I answer the essay question by delving into some kind of intellectual controversy on this issue? And then usually that's going to be pretty easy because the essay question will be about some controversial thing that's happening in the world or that you've examined in the literatures that your course deals with, right? And finally, your thesis statement should explain how the essay will support the proposition. So as your fourth year colleague here, or are you in your fourth year? Yeah, okay, so as your fourth year colleague mentioned, you want to make sure that either right in the thesis statement itself or in and around the thesis statement introductory paragraph, you sort of sketch out the plan of the paper. But in particular, you say in that plan, okay, here's what I'm going to argue in this paper. Here's my claim. And here's how in the paper I'm going to support this claim. Here's the body of literature that I'm going to examine in support of this claim. Or here's the reasons I'm going to adduce in support of it, okay? And note that the thesis statement, though it has to be controversial, it doesn't have to be an original claim. This is something that first-year students often struggle with. It's like, oh, well, because everyone's paranoid about plagiarism, as you should be, I suppose. But people therefore think that, okay, well, my thesis statement has to be some kind of original claim, an original if it's true, it's an original contribution. Well, that's not true. It doesn't have to be an original contribution. You could find, someone else might have made the same argument somewhere. What you want to make sure though is that where the originality comes from is in the argument that supports your thesis statement, right? Your thesis statement might be your thesis statement might be, human rights are real, right? So there's this big debate about whether human rights have a kind of fundamental reality, say. This would be like a political theory question. Well, that's a non-obvious claim because people disagree about it. But either side of that question, if you say yes or no, someone will have already made that claim, right? So you can't have an original point of view on this question. That's fine. What will be original is the way you support one answer over the other, the way you marshal evidence or reasons in support of your thesis statement. So before I move on to the actual argument of an essay, does anyone have any questions about thesis statements? Or about what I just went over? Go ahead.
I have a couple questions.
Yes.
Because I struggle with this.
Okay.
Okay, so we're supposed to respond directly to the question. Right?
Yes.
Right at the beginning. Like
Yes.
you have to basically put everything right in the beginning about what you're going to do. So I always struggle with, okay, how do you structure that part, that beginning of your introduction? Like how long should it really be before you sort of go on a tangent and then your structure is sort of set off? I think that's one of the things I struggle with.
Yeah.
How long should that
That's a great
be?
question. I struggle with that too, actually. It depends a lot on the topic, but I think as a general rule, what you want to do is avoid a lengthy introduction of the issue. Jump right into even your first sentence. In this paper, this is what I'm going to argue. Here's how I'm going to argue it. And then save all the kind of contextualizing of the question and unpacking of it for the body of the essay, for the actual sort of argument part of it. So in your intro, just get right to precisely what you're going to claim in this paper, what the whole thing's going to be revolving around, and how you're going to support that claim in a nutshell. And then you can move on to say, okay, here's why this issue is important. Here's an answer to the who cares question. Sometimes you won't have time even to do that. You'll just have to immediately jump into your argument. But this is a big thing that people struggle with is, well, how much in the intro should I kind of contextualize the question? As a rule in your undergraduate papers, spend as little time contextualizing the question as possible. Get right to what you're going to argue, how you're going to support it, and then go into the actual argument that supports the thesis. So I'm going to jump right into the argument stuff. Because this is, I think, the thing that people really struggle with is arguments. Because what an academic paper does is that it has a central claim and it supports it with an argument. So what is an argument? Like that might seem like a silly question, but actually a lot of people don't know. And maybe like first year students tend not to know, right? So the first thing, an argument isn't a disputation, right? It's not a verbal fist fight, okay? What an argument is it's offering a set of reasons or evidence in support of some non-obvious proposition or claim. So an argument is an attempt to support certain views with reasons rather than simply asserting those views. That's crucial, right? So what you're going to be doing in your paper is you're not just going to summarize something, nor are you going to just assert a bunch of claims, but you're going to assert one main claim, and then you're going to give a bunch of reasons why you think that claim is true, or a bunch of evidence for why that claim is true, okay? And that's what an argument is. So it therefore is persuasive, right? So the question, well, why argue? Well, it's because it explains to or persuade others of opinions that we have found to be well-founded, right? So if I want to persuade you of some assertion that I make, I'm only going to persuade you if I can offer, if you disagree with me, if I can offer compelling reasons to support that claim. So in other words, I explain to you why I think this, right? Maybe it occurs to me as I'm trying to persuade you that, oh, I haven't really thought about this very well, and I don't really have reasons for thinking this thing that I think, which will often occur. But if you have thought it through, then you will have reasons for why you think that, and you can share those reasons with someone else. And that's what you're trying to do. That's the point of arguing. So a good argument. What makes an argument good? Well, there's 5 components of a good argument that I've listed here. But the 2 main ones they have to do with premises, okay? Or the bits of evidence or reasons that are marshaled in support of the main claim of the paper, right? So a good argument is supported by good premises in the sense that, as you guys were mentioning at the beginning, each bit of evidence or each sort of reason why you say this claim is true, you show how that bit of evidence bears on the thesis, right? Because often what happens in student papers is that people they'll sort of just start rambling and writing about stuff, and it's unclear how all that stuff bears on the main point of the paper. So it's really important that your premises, or the stuff that you talk about in support of your thesis statement, is clearly shown to support the thesis statement, right? And the second part is that your premises actually have to be good, right? So it's not enough just to show that the premises support the thesis statement, but you also have to show that those premises themselves are plausible or true. And usually when you in order to do that, you'll cite other people, right? You'll say this study found that, like, there's empirical evidence to show that this premise is true. Sometimes though you won't have time or space to do that, so you'll have to condition your argument. So you'll say, my conclusion follows, or my thesis is only true if this one premise that I have, or several premises, are true. And they might seem plausible premises, but it's important, if you don't provide evidence for each of your premises, that you condition your argument on them. So you're going to say, in this paper, I haven't actually shown that this claim is true. I've shown that it's true if these premises are true, right? Go ahead.
That's a good question.
Yeah.
So how many people do we have to cite just for that in that part?
It varies. There's no hard and fast rule about that.
So it's not just one. You can't say, well, this person said it, so it must be true. You have to show maybe at least two to say that this supports it.
I mean, sometimes one is sufficient. You can say this study found that this is true, and then your argument depends on the veracity of that study, right? But usually in the kind of papers that you guys are going to write, that's going to be sufficient. You can, but as long as your premises are either that they're sometimes your premises can be true by definition, right? That sometimes that's all right. But what matters is that the premises are plausible, and if they're controversial premises, you need to provide some reasons or evidence to support them. So then there's just some other stuff about arguments. You want to make sure they're clear and concise. You want to make sure that they're not the D, that it builds on substance, not overtone. You want to make sure that it's not just you're not just using superlatives or adjectives to make your argument. Like this is really true or something, right? That doesn't support your argument at all, right? So you don't just want to use argumentative language. You want to actually use reasons, right, or evidence. And finally, most importantly, or maybe not most importantly, but very importantly, is that you consider objections to your argument, right? Often people forget to do that, especially if you have a longer paper and you need to kind of fill up space. Entertain an because it's going to be easy to think of. You're going to, okay, how would someone disagree with this, or on what grounds would they disagree with it? And there's going to be lots of grounds to disagree with it usually. So entertain one of those objections and refute it as best you can. If, as might happen, you find that you can't refute it, then you might have to go back to the drawing board in light of that objection, right? It might mean that that's part of the process of reasoning. Sometimes you actually, as you're writing the paper, have to stop because you've come up with an objection to your argument that is decisive. And then you have to change your thesis statement in light of that. But that's fun. I always find that's the most interesting part of writing a paper. Is, oh yeah, this is one of the ways in which we learn, right? And sometimes writing is the best way of learning. So any questions about arguments? That was kind of a lot of stuff I just went over, but that's what an argument. That's what an argument is. What a good argument is. Go ahead.
My first year, I found that when I started writing papers, I would usually summarize rather than
Yes.
analyze.
So common.
What would you say towards that? Or
It's a very common problem. I think I'd reiterate some of the stuff I said actually. So especially this happens especially with political theory papers. So often you'll be asked to write and interpret. Your argument is about an interpretation of a text. Okay. So should we read this text this way or that way? And the temptation is just to sort of summarize it, right? But what we want you to do is to see. The most important thing is to see that the interpretation of the text is controversial too. It's the questions the text deals with are controversial. That's pretty easy to see. But how we read text sometimes is also controversial. And if you want to avoid summarizing, try to see the controversy. Once you identify the controversy, then you can say, okay, well, here's reasons, like textual evidence, why this interpretation that I'm adopting is preferable to this other one, right? And another easy way to avoid summarizing is to think of objections to the summary that you're coming up with, right? Like, because essentially a summary is asserting an interpretation, right, of something, right? You're just sort of saying, this is the way it is. But is that the way it is? Maybe there's reasons why that's not the way it is. Well, we want to see why those reasons, if you're right, we want to see why those reasons are wrong. So that I'd say that's try to see the controversy as a rule.
So if you were presenting an argument against yours, just to say that one exists, how far do you have to go with that? Do you just state that this other sort of perspective exists and then just leave it at that? Or do you have to sort of give another sort of analysis or interpretation based on that?
Usually if you're raising, if you're going to discuss another, sometimes you can say there's a bunch of interpretations out there. I'm going to argue for this particular one. Sometimes it's fine to not address the others, but usually if you're raising alternatives to your view, you're going to want to give reasons that address why those other interpretations or other views are wrong, right? So you're going to say, this is why mine is right, but here's also some considerations why these others are wrong. That makes the paper much more persuasive. But again, it's always going to be a matter of thinking, well, do I have enough space to do that? and sometimes it's a problem. Okay, go ahead.
This is more of a technical question. For direct quotations, are they counted as your word count for like in blocks? So like 1,000.
They are counted in your word count. So that's why I say here, just in this last point, like there's just some other general criteria. And C is really important. Quote appropriately, but selectively. So often you're going to find a strong argument minimizes direct quotations. Paraphrase is better. Sometimes you can just use footnotes, and those won't count, right, in your word count. Yeah, I think that's really helpful. Footnotes typically don't count unless the professor said explicitly that they do. So sometimes you can use footnotes to your advantage, right? You can say, well, you can just sort of paraphrase part of a text, and maybe you want to provide a quotation in a footnote, right? Or some additional consideration. Yeah.
Oh, that's
Yeah. I know all the tricks of the trade. Okay, so I think we're actually out of time. Because these are supposed to be 20-minute sessions. So I had some other stuff I wanted to. So there's this writing center handout. The writing centers are really helpful. Like if you have a paper and you're kind of stuck on it. I mean, it's nice to go talk to your TA about it too. That's usually really helpful. But your TA isn't going to sort of read through your paper before you submit it, right? Whereas the writing centers will. And that can be a massive advantage. So I would strongly recommend taking advantage of the writing centers. And this handout just sort of explains why they're there. There's one in each college. There's also one at each of the satellite campuses, and you have to book appointments with them. So I would get on that early because they tend to book up.
Do you know if one specializes in political science or not? Because I've been to.
I don't know.
And they don't really know how to read political science papers.
Yeah, I don't think any of them do specialize in political science. So there you're gonna have to sort of divide the content stuff and the writing mechanics stuff. So the content stuff, see your TA. The writing mechanics stuff, see the writing center. Yeah. Okay, so sorry guys. I wish we could spend more. There's another group that's gonna come in. So there's an exercise though that you'll notice at the bottom of the second page that is kind of fun to do, just to give you a flavor for arguments. So as you're, I don't know, maybe later on. I thought we were gonna have time to do it, but I don't think we are. This is just an example of like the sketch of an argument, right? Often I find making essay outlines like this is really helpful. Like your outline should consist of the premises of your argument, right? So here's some premises and a conclusion that is ostensibly entailed by them, but is it? So this is like what TAs will do, right? We'll read your paper and sort of implicitly in your mind we'll say, okay, here's the different reason. This will be your thesis statement, which will be the conclusion of the argument, right? The thing that this premises support. But is this thesis statement supported by these premises? And is this thesis statement a response to the essay question? Those are the kind of questions TAs are going to ask, right? And if not, you're going to get dinged. So yeah, I mean, like I said, I think another group. Although I don't see the other group. Maybe we should just go over it while they're. One sec, guys. You guys think about this. I thought maybe. Okay, let's go over it. So suppose you've been asked to write a paper answering a question. This is a classic question. You'll almost certainly be asked this question in one of your poli-sci courses. Why do democratic states tend not to declare war upon one another? So someone might respond to it by saying, okay, well, what's the kind of relevant evidence that might bear on this question? So let's say this person who wrote this up did research, right? And they found, okay, so in one of the articles for this course we read, the article suggested that state behavior is motivated by the perceived interests of the sovereign authority of the state. Okay, and you might just you might not even cite the second premise. You might not even cite secondary sources to support this. You might just say this might be one of these claims, like an if claim, right? So if it's true that in democracy, sort of by definition, involve majority rule, right? The rule of the majority. So, although of course many democracies don't really behave as though the majority rules because elites co-opt power from the majority. But let's say this argument only bears on actual democracies, right? Like you might say something like that. And then this third premise and fourth premise, you probably have to find secondary sources to support these premises, right? And each of these premises, by the way, might be a paragraph or a whole section in a paper, probably a whole section. You're going to have to devote some analysis to supporting each premise. And if all of these are true, then this is the conclusion that you come to. But what I'm asking you guys is, when you look at this, is this a good argument based on the criteria that I've given you for what a good argument is? So for instance, does this conclusion follow from those premises? Do those premises entail that conclusion? What do you guys think? Go ahead.
We like to use common sense, common knowledge.
Definitely, yeah. Well, what I'm asking though isn't, I don't want you to try to, you could, so maybe you're going to say one of these premises is wrong. You're going to say that?
I was going to say the conclusion precludes that democratic states will declare war on states that do not stand a chance of doing significant damage against them. As in, they won't.
Interesting.
State A
That's
will declare
interesting.
war on state B of equal size, but it can just easily declare war on state C of smaller and just insignificant size.
Yeah.
That's why you see like more democratic states like the United States, for example, going into smaller states in the Middle East that do not stand a chance of harming them aside from occasionally knocking out one of their unmanned drones.
Right.
So they can, if they went to war against a large state like Russia, China, whatever, they would have to use manpower and put themselves at considerable risk in order to do that. Whereas if they went to war against a smaller state that does not stand a chance against anything they have, they can use unmanned.
Yeah, that's a great point. And it's sure enough, that's what we see happening in the world. Yeah, that's a good point. Go ahead, did you?
I don't know if the conclusion exactly addresses the question, it might just be the wording. But the question speaks of democratic states fighting each other, whereas the conclusion
Excellent.
argues that democratic states won't.
Come on in, guys. No, excellent. Yeah, that was the big thing I wanted to get you to see is that, well, the conclusion, which is going to be your thesis statement, doesn't actually respond to the essay question. It doesn't directly respond to the essay question. It's sort of it might be related, but it doesn't directly respond to it. So you can see how someone might say, well, I don't know, this argument, it's plausible, but it doesn't do what you need it to do, right? And there's other things we can say about it too, but now we're really out of time. So thanks so much, guys.